For the debate, I recognize the member from Guelph.
Oh, thank you, Speaker. It's always an honor to rise today to debate Bill 216, the government's fall economic statement. And since the economic statement was released yesterday, I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me feeling abandoned by this government. Young people who are forced to leave Ontario because they can't afford to buy a home. Full-time workers who can't pay the rent in the communities they work in. An unprecedented number of people experiencing homelessness right now in Ontario. The 2.5 million people looking for a family doctor or primary health care provider. The 2,000 people experiencing hallway medicine, which has doubled over the last 5 years. People with disabilities being forced to live in legislated poverty. Children stuck on a never-ending wait list to access mental health services. Families desperately seeking supports as programs and services for people with developmental disabilities are cut. Children with autism and their families on a wait list that's ballooned now to 73,000 people. People whose basements this summer were flooded because our infrastructure isn't ready for the severe, unsafe weather events fueled by the climate crisis. Speaker, the list is long of people feeling abandoned, and it's growing. As the Ontario Green leader, I oftentimes talk about the climate crisis, but I think right now in Ontario we're experiencing a deeper crisis. It's a crisis of caring for the most vulnerable in our society. People who are struggling, people who are trying to get by, people who depend on public services, and they look at a government that yesterday handed out $200 checks to millionaires and billionaires like Galen Weston. You know, I had Professor Jennifer Robson, who is a professor of tax policy at Carleton University. She specializes in how tax policy is implemented. And she said what I suspected, that the most vulnerable people in Ontario likely will not receive $200 checks because they don't file taxes, because they don't need to, and because many of them are experiencing homelessness and do not have an address to send a check to. Those folks desperately need $200. I don't know if millionaires and billionaires need $200. I know those folks need $200. The government didn't go out of its way to come up with an alternative plan for those folks to get $200, but they did come up with an alternative plan for people who make too much money to qualify for the Canadian Child Tax Benefit to apply for $200 for their children. So I would ask the government, what kind of society are we living in? What kind of society are we creating when the most vulnerable, the most desperate in our province can't even have access to the little $200 check they're sending out, when millionaires and billionaires get it? Speaker, in this bill and in the fall economic statement, we learned what many of us have been saying would happen. Housing starts are going down, they're not going up. The housing crisis is getting worse. The primary driver of the affordability crisis in the province of Ontario is the lack of access to housing. It's affecting middle income, working people, people on social assistance. People are struggling to get a home. And I know the finance minister yesterday said, you know, the reason Ontario is not going to hit its targets is because of high interest rates. And there's no doubt there are high interest rates. But you know what? It's not affecting other provinces which are having far higher housing starts than the province of Ontario is. The number of housing starts per 10,000 residents, Canada average for that is 41. You know what it is in Ontario? 35. We're not even at the Canadian average. As a matter of fact, Alberta is far ahead of us at 69, British Columbia 57, PEI 61. Other provinces are figuring out how to build homes when Ontario is not. Why are we not building homes? Well, the Premier has said no to changing zoning laws to make it easier for gentle density and missing middle housing. He said no to my bill to say fourplexes should be as of right across the province. One builder told me that if only 18% of existing single-family homes in Ontario became a fourplex, that would be 1.5 million homes built where we already have infrastructure in place. He said no to my bill to build 6 to 11 stories as of right on major transportation corridors. I had a number of builders tell me that if they'd say yes to that, we could cut times in half for building those mostly purpose-built rental, but also some condominiums in there as well. If we don't start saying yes to housing, we're never going to hit this target. As a matter of fact, the province's own Housing Affordability Task Force, those were their two primary recommendations, was to say yes to legalizing gentle density and missing middle housing. Speaker, as my colleague from Kitchener Centre pointed out on multiple occasions, renters are being failed in this province. We have to say yes to bringing in protections from renters. We have to say yes to fixing the landlord and tenant board, which isn't working for landlords or tenants. And this province has to start getting back into building nonprofit, co-op, and permanent supportive housing. 93% of the deeply affordable homes in the province of Ontario right now were built before 1995. What happened in 1995? The province got out of building those kinds of homes. So no wonder the housing crisis is getting worse and worse each and every year. No wonder 200,000 people are unhoused tonight. And I know the Premier made some comments in the media about how we should take their charter rights away when it comes to encampments. And I just want to say, where are these folks supposed to go? There is no housing for them. Unless we start saying yes to building deeply affordable homes. The Co-op Housing Federation was just here yesterday. They're ready to help us build 250,000 homes that are deeply affordable, which is exactly what Scotiabank is calling for. They're saying the province and the federal government have to get back into the game of building housing, but unfortunately, we had a chance in the fall economic statement to do that, but the government decided to send $200 checks to millionaires, billionaires instead. Healthcare, Speaker. I have so many residents in my riding calling me. I got 3 texts today. Can you help me get a family doctor? And I do everything I can. I work with the family health team. I'm calling folks, trying to get folks access to a doctor or a primary health care provider. But the reality is 2.5 million people don't have access to a doctor or a primary health care provider right now. 2,000 people being cared for in a hallway right now. We have hospitals in the province of Ontario, especially in rural ridings, taking out lines of credit just to meet payroll. Hiring private agency nurses because they've lost so many of their staff due to the government's wage restraint legislation and paying millions more for that. That's why people are waiting in emergency departments. That's why we're seeing temporary closures of emergency departments. That's why we're seeing so many people not being able to access healthcare services. And yet there was a 4% increase in the fall economic statement, not even enough to meet inflation, let alone the costs of dealing with the government's unconstitutional legislation. Mental health. And I know the minister's here, and I want to appreciate the minister coming to my riding to open a youth wellness hub. Thank you for that. That was a great day in Guelph just a few weeks ago. But I also want to acknowledge that 30,000 kids are on a wait list right now to access mental health services. There's this conversation happening in Ontario right now about involuntary care. Well, how can you even have that conversation when people who want care for mental health or addictions treatment can't access it because there aren't enough care providers. And, Canadian Mental Health Association and others are saying we need funding increases to hire people to be able to meet the demand that exists in the province of Ontario. ODSP recipients trying to live on $1,300 a month. You know what their housing allowance is? The shelter allowance is $556, Speaker. Average market rent in Ontario is over $2,000. Just the math doesn't add up. Yet poverty costs this province $33 billion a year. It'd just be far cheaper to end legislated poverty and take the stress off our health care system, our mental health care system, our criminal justice system, our first responders. Developmental services. I have parents coming to my office right now. Speaker, I'm talking about this because I think the people of Ontario need to hear some of these stories because I don't think everyone realizes the crisis state that our caring professions are in right now. I had a woman come into my office and say, my son, who has a developmental disability, has been on the housing wait list for 10 years, hasn't moved at all, desperate. She had tears in her eyes. She said, do I have to commit suicide to make things so bad in our family that my son can move up the list? So I talked to the treasurer of our community living in Guelph Wellington. He's saying that over the last 30 years, they've received a 7% increase in funding. Inflation during that time has been 60%. He's like, that's why we're selling off group homes. That's why we're cutting programs and services. He's like, we just don't have the money. The math doesn't add up. I want to close, and I'm almost out of time, but I just want to close. There were a lot of fantasies about tunnels and highways that are uncosted in this budget. But we don't even have enough money to maintain our existing roads and bridges. The backlog for roads and bridge repairs, $25 billion in this province. That's why in rural ridings you're seeing roads and bridges closed. The cost of climate to our infrastructure is going to be $4 billion a year. Nothing in this budget for it. It was $1 billion just this summer in Toronto alone, Speaker. I think we can do better.
Questions? I recognize the Associate Minister of Mines.
Speaker, and to the member opposite, thank you for your presentation. You did touch on housing. I think all of us in the House recognize we have a housing issue in the province, given the population increase here over the last couple of years, which is second to none in North America. Our government's put through some proposals. We've had more purpose-built rentals, in fact, record number with getting rid of the tax on purpose-built rentals. We're increasing density around transit areas, including GTA areas like Mississauga, in Toronto, and my community of Oakville. What more do you feel we can do specifically around transit hubs? We've put some policies through. What more should we be doing around transit hubs to increase intensification around those particular hubs?
Response, the member from Guelph.
Thank you, Speaker. I appreciate the member's question. So, first of all, I would say let's follow the Housing Affordability Task Force put together by your government to legalize 6 to 11 stories as a right along major transit and transportation corridors. That would cut building time in half, according to builders, and would be the fastest and cheapest way that we could increase housing supply. I would also say for the government to reverse their reversal on doing some of the transit-oriented density around certain transit stops that the government's backed off on, because I agree with you. We should have density around transit stops. So let's make it easy, let's make it legal, let's get rid of the red tape so we can actually start building that gentle density and missing middle we need. And then finally, I would say, you know what, there's a lot of single-family homes in and around transit stops. Why don't we legalize multiplexes? Again, almost every builder, housing expert I talk to says that's the fastest and cheapest way we can quickly increase market supply. Further questions?
I recognize the member from Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to say I appreciate the presentation that's made by the member. In his presentation, he referred to the support that people need when they're hit by climate-driven flooding, and I'd like to know if in his exploration of the document there is funding for climate adaptation or support for those who are affected by extreme weather driven by the climate.
Response, the member from Guelph.
Yeah, I appreciate the member's question. I didn't find anything in the fall economic statement about that. I think climate change was mentioned once in the entire fall economic statement. So I just want to say that the average cost to a basement flood is $42,000 for just one house. That's just one house. The cost to the city of Toronto alone this summer, so it's even bigger when you start factoring in the GTA and stuff. According to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, when we had that big storm back in, August, July, $1 billion, Speaker, over $1 billion. The estimate is the uninsurable losses were likely triple that. Think about that. Just one day due to unsafe weather events. Those costs are only going to escalate for people and the public if we don't actually start getting our infrastructure climate ready. And I saw nothing in the fall economic statement that even mentioned it.
Further questions? A member from Peterborough-Kawartha.
Thank you, Speaker. What we saw from in the fall economic statement is that organizations like Moody's, Morningstar DBRS, S&P have all either given an upgrade to our credit rating or put us on a positive watch because they believe that we're actually doing the things that we need to do financially to make sure that our economy is doing well. That means that our interest rates will go down on money that we borrow. What we saw in the fall economic statement then is $1 billion less in interest than what we had projected because of that. Yet you say that we're doing the wrong thing. The 4 major credit agencies have said that Ontario is on the right path. We're the only government in Canada right now that is on the path to balance. What do you have to say to the 4 major credit agencies who disagree with what you just said?
Response, a member from Guelph.
So first of all, I appreciate the question from the member from Peterborough. I don't think they disagree with anything I said. Budgets are about priorities. So saving $1 billion on interest payments, good thing. I'm not going to argue about that. What I'm opposed to is the fact that millionaires and billionaires, and even people with 6-figure incomes, are getting a $200 check at a cost of over $3 billion when we have so many other needs among the most vulnerable in our communities. The other thing that I didn't even mention is $7.3 billion goes to be the only jurisdiction in North America to subsidize electricity prices. And according to the Financial Accountability Officer, that disproportionately benefits wealthy people. So the government has made a lot of decisions to provide rebates and benefits to the most wealthy in our society. Meanwhile, we have people living in legislated poverty. We have people with developmental disabilities not being able to access housing. We have record numbers of people experiencing homelessness. So for me, it's about priorities. I would prioritize money to help working, middle income, and the most vulnerable, and not the wealthiest in our society.
Further questions? I recognize the member from
Humber River, Black Creek.
Humber River, Black Creek.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank the member, of course. He is one of the hardest working people here at Queen's Park. And I want to say to him, one of the things that we heard a lot about from Conservatives, especially during the government previous, was pointing out that Ontario had one of the largest sub-sovereign debts on earth. And I don't know why, but for some reason we don't hear this sort of language anymore. And of course, we are all hearing about the potential of a looming election, and all of a sudden a $200 pre-vote inducement fund is going out that'll cost $3 billion to the taxpayers of Ontario. So there seems to be a lot less interest in dealing with the debt in light of some of the announcements that the government has been making. What are your thoughts on this?
Response, the member from Guelph.
I appreciate the question. Well, if I'm not mistaken, Ontario still has the largest debt of any sub-sovereign jurisdiction in the world. So that hasn't improved. So it is true. This is why I want to talk about the fact that, $3 billion to hand $200 checks to millionaires, billionaires, and people with 6-figure incomes. Why didn't they means test that and just have it for the people who need it the most? $1.5 billion a year, each and every year, for the license stickers. Again, disproportionately benefits people who own multiple vehicles. Why didn't we prioritize those types of savings for people who are struggling the most. So it's an issue of priorities when it comes to fiscal management. And something like poverty, for example, costs our province $33 billion a year. So why don't we just, it'd be cheaper just in poverty than actually have all those additional expenses. So it's just a matter of priorities.
Quick question, quick response. I recognize the member from Peterborough Kawartha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to touch on something that the member just talked about in his last answer. In my riding, there are 128,000 people. The average income as of 2016 was $69,000 for a family. That means that 64,000 people in my riding earn $69,000 a year or less, and they're all going to get a check for $200. And yet the member opposite talks about billionaires. I don't have a single billionaire in my riding. Disproportionately, 64,000 people in my riding with an income of less than $69,000 are going to get a $200 check. Can the member not agree that is something that will help 64,000 people in my riding alone?
Response, the member from Guelph.
I appreciate the member's question as always. Like I said in response to the last question, I don't understand why the government didn't means test this. I don't understand why the government doesn't mean test their electricity subsidy. I don't understand why they don't target it to the people who earn $69,000 or less. Instead of people, well, why not means test it so it's targeted to those folks instead of people who make 6, 7, and 8-figure incomes? To me, that's the smarter way to go. And I would also say to the member opposite, the university in his riding would like to see sufficient money in place. Members in his riding would like to have access to a family doctor. They would like to go to an emergency department where there isn't a long wait time or their loved ones aren't being cared in a hallway. They would actually like access to affordable housing. So those neighbors of theirs who are living in tents have an affordable place to call home. There are costs associated with the fiscal decisions this government is making that have real detriment to many people in this province.